It is difficult to imagine a person who is not a minister or a prime minister or a president or a secretary general of an international organization who has had such impact, who is listened to with such attention, and whose generosity has been on such a scale that it has made a huge impact for this idea of an open society, for higher education. It took 20 member states to create the European University Institute. It took one man to create the Central European University, a sister institution. It's my pleasure to introduce George Soros. Welcome and thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much.
And you have recently published a book. You have recently published a book, and it has a provocative title, The Tragedy of Europe. Why the tragedy of Europe? What is the tragedy of Europe, sir?
Well, let me answer you first in very general, abstract terms, and then we can look at concrete examples, because that's where the reality is. If you look at my generation and older, people for whom the traumatic experience was the Second World War, they found the idea of European Union something very exciting, desirable, because they were concerned not to have a repetition of the Second World War and wars generally in Europe. And they were also confronting the present threat at the time of the Soviet Union as a threat to Europe. And generally, the basic idea was to find a way towards international governance. First within Europe, but basically also globally. Because in Europe, you had a common background, common culture, and so on. So it was like a microcosm in which to try this. So it was very attractive. The psychoanalysts have a word for it, fantastic object. But unfortunately, ideas never quite correspond to reality. And this fantastic object, when it became reality, it bears very little resemblance to what was then very attractive. And specifically, now you have a new generation for whom the traumatic experience is the Euro crisis. And for them, this fantastic object is no longer attractive. And actually, they are looking for something else. In fact, the fantastic object has become the opposite of something that's attractive. And what has happened is that the European Union, that was meant to be a voluntary association of equal states that sacrificed part of their sovereignty for the common good, something totally different. It became a relationship between creditors and debtors, where the debtors have difficulty in meeting their obligations, and that puts the creditors in charge. And that relationship is neither voluntary nor is it among equals? Because you then have at least two different classes, the creditor class and the debtor class. And that is the reality of the European Union today.
And that's what you call the European tragedy.
That is a tragedy, because what was a fantastic object is now something that is increasingly rejected, and people who find the current conditions, particularly in the Eurozone, unacceptable, they are all driven into an anti-European political direction. And at the same time, you now have an alternative emerging. And that is actually the successor to the Soviet Union, Russia. And not only Russia, there are other similar governments which take and exploit a nationalist ideology or emotion. And they are exploiting it to their personal benefit. In other words, these are charismatic rulers who use this emotional sense of nationalism to their personal benefits, to establish themselves as a new form of autocratic ruler.
But if I understand you correctly, if Europe is to exit from this tragic situation, two things would have to happen. There would have to be a new fantastic object narrative, something that can capture the imagination of a new generation, and one would have to get out of this hierarchical relationship within the Eurozone of creditors, debtors, non-voluntary, etc. So I'm sure everybody here wants to, what would be your ideas, what could be the new fantastic object, the new narrative, the new European dream, so to speak?
Maybe because I'm so old and I can't invent new things, I would like to recapture the original concept that we have lost, but I think we could regain it. And actually, that's really the challenge before us, because we now have a competition between two different concepts of governance. One is which is democratic and is international, so international governance and democracy, human rights, rule of law at home. And that's, let's say, the concept, the original concept, the one I think we need to regain. And the alternative is based on the idea that each nation needs to find its own solutions. So it's looking for a nationalist solution. And if that becomes the norm, then you are back in a state of conflict that could easily deteriorate into war. And you now actually are on the verge of civil war in Ukraine.
Let's come back to Ukraine in a minute or two, but go back. The second part of your diagnosis was to say it's not only the disappearance of the fantastic object, where in part Europe is a victim of its own success, because the trauma that your generation suffered is simply not a reality for a new generation, and that's to the credit of Europe. But you also say it's because the reality didn't turn out to be as good as the dream, and you mention the euro crisis, the creditor-debtor, etc. So, two specific questions there. Do you think the euro crisis was managed well? And what do you think should be our next steps in order to undo this kind of situation that you describe?
No, my answer is very unequivocal. It was terribly mismanaged. And it has created a tremendous amount of human suffering which is unnecessary. And that is due to a set of circumstances which I explore in great detail in the book. We can go into it, but I think it's more important to look forward rather than back. But I mean, basically, to my mind, the European Union was the embodiment of the idea of open society, which is another fantastic object. And if you take the underlying idea of open society, which Karl Popper, who was the exponent of that, it's the recognition that our understanding of the world in which we live is inherently imperfect, and all human constructs have flaws in them, which need to be corrected by a process of trial and error. And he was advocating piecemeal social engineering, although I think sometimes when you have a really bad situation where the misunderstandings are too deeply ingrained, you need something more radical than piecemeal. And that is what you had, for instance, when the Soviet Union disintegrated. You needed a radical change. You couldn't do it piecemeal. So that's where we are today. And
so in terms of looking to the future, I agree. If we can say the past is the past, let's not be Lot's wife who looks backwards and turns into a pillar of salt. But what would be, in terms of managing the current situation in Europe, what would be for you the highest priorities, the steps, the most decisive steps that one has to take? And then maybe we could move to talk a little bit about the Ukraine.
Well, basically, you've got two sets of problems. One has to do with the euro itself, because it's a patently inadequate design. The fathers of the euro knew that, but they had reason to believe that when the inadequacy manifests itself, the political will could be gathered to make up for the deficiency of having a common currency, but not having a common treasury. So you have common monetary policy, but not fiscal policy. But there was also a flaw in it that the authors didn't understand, and even people today I don't understand it. And that is that the member states, by delegating the right to print money, effectively, when they were borrowing for the government, a national debt, they were borrowing in a foreign currency, because they could not print the money that you need if you borrow in your own currency. You can always pay your debt. If you borrow in your own currency, you can't go bankrupt. So the danger of bankruptcy it doesn't exist. Here, by doing this, the danger of bankruptcy arose, and they were not, neither the authorities nor the financial markets recognized this. So the central bank accepted the Maastricht Treaty, first of all, declared the national debt to be riskless. And it turned out to be anything but riskless. And the central bank was willing to lend the face value on the government bonds, irrespective of what their market value was. And those two mistakes created the euro crisis. And that deficiency has not been remedied. On the contrary, in a very gradual way, this idea that government bonds actually carry risk is built into the system now. And this was done retroactively, and a certain number of countries, the heavily indebted countries, have accumulated a lot of debt before this change occurred. And they are now at a basic disadvantage. So you have an uneven playing field, where the creditors enjoy a benefit and the debtor countries are at a handicap. And as a result, this creditor-debtor difference is not being eliminated. It's getting worse and worse. So, for instance, now let's say the markets have hit bottom, the economies have hit bottom. But what does it mean? It means that the creditor countries are growing and the debtor countries are still sinking. So the divergence is getting wider. And the result of that is going to be, I think, a lot of political crises. In other words, you had a financial crisis that lasted about 4 years. It peaked actually in June 2003, when at this summit, actually Italy, Mario Monti, who I think is here, said to Chancellor Merkel that you must do something to give us relief. We are now working to change the internal conditions, but we need help. And unless you provide it, we are going to oppose any agreement. And Chancellor Merkel said, I understand your problem and we'll do whatever we can. And Monti accepted that, and the summit didn't sort of flop. But afterwards it turned out that actually nothing could be done, because the lawyers who dictate now economic policy, it's not economists who decide or central bankers, it's the legal department of the central bank. They said nothing is possible. So then you had a real crisis, and the risk premiums rose to unsustainable levels. And then Chancellor Merkel turned to the president of the ECB and said, do whatever needs to be done to save the euro, and I'll back you. And with that backing, Draghi made his famous pronouncement that we will do whatever it takes to save the euro. But of course, that's only possible if he has the unquestioned promise of Germany.
He was saying that the second problem has not been fixed. So what needs to be done to resolve that second problem?
You need to find a way to create a more level playing field, and most of all, to generate growth. Because now the financial crisis is over, the euro is here to stay, the financial markets are actually in a state of euphoria because there's a lot of money coming in, investment money coming in, looking for bargains. But you have to find some way to make up this, level the playing field.
And what would be the main instrument that one could use to make up the level playing field?
Well, I don't think there is one now, actually. The euro is here to stay, and the system is basically a system of inequality between creditors and debtors, which is liable to last for a long time. But what could be done and is needed is to find some a prospect of growth, because you can never, debts are never repaid, government debts are never repaid, but you can grow out of them by the economy growing faster than the debt. It's a very long process, quite painful, but that's the way you can correct it, and that's the only thing that is now available.
Mr. Soros, thank you. You told me that you wanted to speak about Ukraine, and it's very much on our mind, and I think everybody would be interested in your perspective on that particular crisis.
Well, I have to confess that I'm very much personally involved, because I established a foundation there to support civil society, the Ukrainian Renaissance Foundation, and the foundation was actually established before Ukraine became independent, so it was then still part of the Soviet Union, and the foundation has done a lot in supporting civil society, and because of that I watch Ukraine very closely, and actually there is a new Ukraine that was born on Maidan. The fact that people were willing to sacrifice their lives for their country, which is of course in a way a form of nationalism, patriotism, and actually succeeded. And a number of people were killed by police firing live ammunition, and the people actually storming them. They were defending themselves before, and then on February 21st, they actually attacked the police, and with some people being killed and wounded, they nevertheless reached the police, and the police ran away. So this was a very unusual event where unarmed civilians actually overwhelmed the security force firing live ammunition. And that was the birth of a new Ukraine. And right now, you have a lot of people there who really want to break with the corruption and venality of the regime that prevailed until then. So it's the best of Ukraine right now. Of course, there are some nationalist extremists because Ukraine doesn't have a very good record as far as anti-Semitism, etc. But it's a very, very small minority, and I would say the transitional leadership basically comes from civil society. There's a loss of trust in politicians, and a certain number of people have been educated abroad, and those that came back, they basically, many of them didn't want to go into business because that was very corrupt, and didn't want to go to government. So they actually became part of civil society. And they are the ones who were actually leading Maidan and who are now dominant in this transitional government. So that Ukraine believes in the ideas that were at the foundation of the European Union. So they believe in a European Union which doesn't actually currently exist. And at the same time, the Europeans don't realize that a new Ukraine has been born, and the European Union itself, in its association agreement, which they designed in 2011 for a different Ukraine, the Ukraine of Yanukovych. And it was very carefully designed with benchmarks and so on. There's been a revolution, a revolutionary change, but the authorities and also the general public has not actually recognized that there is a new Ukraine that at least has been conceived, not born. And that is a Ukraine that believes in what Europe ought to be.
So what should we be doing instead?
Well, we should be supporting that new Ukraine. It's sanctions against Russia actually are just gestures. They are symbolic gestures. It's a charade. But there is now a competition between Putin's Russia, which stands for nationalism and the use of brute force, ethnic nationalism, which is actually very discriminating because nearly half the Russian population, or the population of Russia, is not Russian. And it, of course, it's the brute force that captured Crimea. But now, Putin, to his credit, one has to acknowledge that he's developed a very clever and 21st century method of waging this quasi-war, where you rely on special forces and propaganda.
You meant to his credit in a sort of ironic way.
No, it's successful.
Yes.
I mean, it came as a surprise to me. I didn't realize that he is capable of that. But it works, and it's working wonders in terms of success. And what I'm afraid of is that this new model, based on nationalism as the emotional support, and manipulating that sentiment, develops a regime to benefit the rulers, because the rulers are, of course, doing it for their own benefit. In other words, they use the state as a milking cow, state capture. That's the characteristic. And it unfortunately seems to be a more successful model than the European Union. And that's a tragedy. That's the tragedy.
So last night, you told us...
in the case of Ukraine, it's very clear that there's going to be a competition. Putin is going to pour quite a bit of money into Crimea. They've raised the retirement pensions to fourfold to meet the Russian, because after all, Russia is rich in resources, so they can actually distribute some of that money to the people, and they do it. So a lot of money is going to go into Ukraine, into Crimea, and Europe ought to recognize that they have an obligation to support the new Ukraine, and at the same time, if they succeed, I think that would also help Europe to rediscover itself. In other words, to reestablish, to regain the moral basis on which it is founded.
So the radical idea is to say, forget about sanctions, they just a charade, as you said a minute ago.
Well, I mean, you have to do it because Russia actually did violate the Budapest...
No, but that's not going to be the remedy. The real remedy was a kind of European Marshall Plan for the Ukraine. Yeah. A very substantial support. And could you give us a sort of euro amount? When we say very substantial support, what are we talking about?
The most important thing actually wouldn't cost anything, because you would need to give political risk insurance to European firms that invest in Ukraine, either in partnership with Ukrainian firms or establishing subsidiaries, both in bringing Ukrainian products into the European market and producing for the Ukrainian market or selling into Ukraine. So given the uncertainty and the pressure that Ukraine is under, its very existence is very uncertain indeed. Very few firms can take that risk. And that risk should be taken by Europe, and if Europe takes it, it will not cost them anything, because the risk would not have to be converted into payments, because actually Ukraine, with that help, would succeed. That's one thing. The second thing is the European bureaucracy needs to be seriously modified to become more flexible, because it's extremely rigid. It has a plan for Ukraine that was designed in 2011. It hasn't been changed. And for instance, right now, the first thing is to have a new constitution which distributes power to the local authorities, and this has to be a Ukrainian proposal. But under the association agreement, the Venice Commission foresaw that there could be no judicial and constitutional reform for at least 4 years. So it's very low down in the priorities of the European bureaucracy. So they have to adjust to the changed circumstances where this is the top priority, and Ukraine is ready to do it. And of course, Putin is maneuvering to get the European Union cooperate with Russia to impose a federal constitution on the German model, which is not what the Ukrainians want. So if Europe actually cooperates with Russia on that, because both sides want to avoid civil war, then Europe becomes complicit in the destruction of the new Ukraine. It's a little complicated what I'm saying, but I think it does make sense.
It makes a lot of sense. Would there have to be an element of direct foreign investment, not just giving political loan guarantees?
Well, I think they need political loan guarantees. The investments ought not to be coming from the state budget, because that's very inefficient. Sure. It should be private enterprise that would be doing the... But you would need also some support for rebuilding the government, the mechanism of the government, because that other governments can be helpful. So you would need judicial reform, for instance. As I told you, the Venice Commission said you have to give the judiciary lifetime tenure. But in effect, you first have to change the judges, because the current judges are corrupt, and the Ukrainian people want nothing more than to have a better judges.
It's, I'm afraid we've almost run out of time, so I'm just going to ask you one last question, because it seems an imaginative thing. This will pour money into the Ukraine because the firms will not be taking a political risk, and to become flexible with conditions which were written. And yet, what is your expectation whether this will actually happen?
Look, I'm biased because I would like it to happen. So don't ask me to it's when things look the most hopeless that they are liable to change. I've had many experiences where you do the right thing because you believe in it. That's the big difference, incidentally, between investing in the stock market, which I used to do, and having a philanthropy. that when you invest in a market, you do it to make a profit. And in a foundation, you do it because it's the right thing. So you fight losing battles and you win in the end.
Well, if there's one man who might make this actually happen, he's sitting next to me. Thank you very, very much, George Soros, on behalf of everybody.
Thank you.